We are back once again with another look at Days Gone, this time the performance. In our initial video, we tested the game with patch version 1.02, but knowing that some patches were incoming right around launch, we decided to wait and see how the final version of the game has shaped up that everyone will play on launch day. And that's exactly what we're looking at today. And to discuss it, I am joined by Richard Ledbetter. Richard?
Hello, how are you doing?
Pretty good. I'm, enjoying some nice time here. I think we've both enjoyed our time with Days Gone as well, and we've had a chance to see how it's running in the current version of the game.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at performance in this video, which a lot of people have got questions about, and we're also going to be doing perhaps a closer look at the platform comparisons between the base PS4 and the Pro, but I don't think there's been a huge amount of movement there since you looked at it for your main analysis piece.
Exactly.
But where do we begin?
Well, I think for this one, I think everybody wants to know about the performance. But the first thing you're going to see when you fire up Days Gone is obviously going to be a cutscene. And this game uses real-time cutscenes, but it does highlight some occasional weirdness in terms of performance. It's mostly fine, but I think you notice this as well. Some slight oddities that can crop up during some of these sequences.
First of all, I think we need to stress that this isn't really a big deal at all. It's just a weird sort of artifact. On scene cuts, you get a kind of ghosting effect, like a crossfade, which may well be down to the temporal accumulation. And then in the very first cutscene, which kind of sets the narrative tone for the game, you get these lurching stutters as well. Thankfully, they don't occur elsewhere, to the best of my knowledge. Just a bit of an oddity there.
Yeah, it's a strange thing. I was kind of surprised to see it. At first, I almost thought they were trying it. If you actually look at it frame by frame, it almost looks like a crossfade. So I was thinking maybe it's related to the checkerboard rendering or the temporal AA. But either way, it just manifests as a very slight, subtle stutter. Again, not a huge deal, but since this is going to be, your first impression of playing Days Gone, it did stick out to me in a weird way, and it's still present in the current version of the game. But obviously, people are not here to play the cutscenes, and for the most part, they're fine. I think the game's performance issues kind of come into a few different camps. And honestly, performance in general is pretty good, especially in this current state. But there's streaming issues, there's occasional issues with alpha overdraw, and then there's occasional issues with just, I guess, GPU-related performance or stuff with the Horde. And it's more pronounced on base. So let's kind of talk about each of these then. So the streaming, I think, is the issue that most users are probably going to notice throughout the game, and it's the thing that stuck out to me right away. This is something that does appear to have been slightly improved with the day one patch versus the version that I first played, which was of course 1.02.
Yeah, this is interesting because it starts right at the beginning of the game, which has a bike chase. And it's not just an ordinary bike chase, because at the beginning of the game you have a, super fast, fully tooled up bike.
Yep.
So, you can do nitrous boosts and whatnot straight from the off. So I guess it is an interesting workout for the engine in terms of, pulling in the data from the hard drive, decompressing it, and then, rendering it. So the Pro is pretty much flawless, a few hiccups here and there, but nothing you're really going to notice. Whereas on the base system, you do get more sustained drops. And I guess, in this initial test, it's not really too bad. But then I've got some footage here of when we initially leave the first camp that you encounter. And again, you're starting to see similar kinds of drops there on the base unit. So, you can see fundamentally that it's not really a massive problem because it is fleeting, but at the same time, the Pro isn't doing it at all.
Yeah, and that's kind of the sense, because you do spend a lot of time riding your bike around the game, and you do so at high speeds often. And I do feel that the base console experience just isn't quite where it should be in that sense. They don't look like a lot when you're just looking at the frame time graph there. It's not that severe, except for, there's a few instances where it kind of hangs low for a while, but in general you just get this inconsistent feeling of stutter that sort of permeates the experience, and it's not something you see so much when you're on foot. It really does seem tied directly to asset streaming that is a part of, moving through the world quickly, because there is a lot of detail in this world.
I mean, this is the worst bit that I found in the first couple of hours of play, where we are, again, riding through a dense forest. It's night time. We've got dynamic weather in place here. The rain is coming down. And we're hitting a low of about 25 frames per second on the base unit, which isn't great. But again, something which is kind of curious here is that even the Pro is starting to struggle just a little bit there.
So I've talked to other people that have been playing the game, and this is what's fascinating. So the experience does seem to be slightly variable. I've heard instances of situations where there was more pronounced stuttering than what we're seeing here. Versus our experience here. So I'm starting to wonder if there's something to do with the health of the hard drive, how full the hard drive is, whether you use an external or internal. All of these things could play into the performance of asset streaming, which I feel is the chief bottleneck here. More than anything with the GPU or CPU, I think it's just pulling those assets from the disk and getting them into memory. And if it can't pull it fast enough, you're going to get these stutters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of streaming, the Pro has an advantage in terms of CPU, so it can bring in assets from the hard drive quicker. And I also suspect that the drive itself is probably faster. Now, I can't emulate a slower hard drive or a fragmented hard drive or whatever, but what we can do is kind of do it in the opposite direction. So here's what happened when I used an SSD, I believe it was a Samsung 860, on the base PlayStation, and you can see here that comparing a mechanical laptop drive, which is extremely slow, to a super fast SSD, no difference whatsoever. So I think in this case it's more likely down to the CPU power. And remember, the Pro has a 2.13 GHz CPU versus 1.6 GHz in the base unit.
So yeah, that's pretty much problem one. And again, it's not atypical for an open world game, and honestly it does run better overall than something like a Red Dead Redemption 2, for instance, at least on most consoles. But I think there is another issue that I encountered, and I think you've had more time with this current updated version of the game. So at a couple points I noticed huge frame time spikes, essentially, or more like gulfs, if you will, where the whole game would pause for upwards of 200 milliseconds, and it was as if it was loading in the whole next area, or like a big chunk at once, and you really got the feeling that the game was just seizing up for it, and that was a little bit jarring, I feel. And has that improved at all with the latest version?
Okay, so I think I know what you're talking about here, but I didn't find it in the same areas as you did.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, but I think I found a similar phenomenon happening elsewhere. But for you, it kind of happened outside a camp?
Yeah. One of the early camps, the Nero camps that you have to raid.
Well, that's interesting, because what we're looking at here is some stutter that happens when you enter a camp, but I don't think it's what you're talking about here in terms of a sustained frame time spike. But I did actually get a similar phenomenon when you look at this. What we're looking at here is actually a stress test that I was trying to manufacture without creating story spoilers or whatever. But essentially there is a zombie horde next to this Nero station. What I noticed on the PlayStation 4 base unit is that a couple of times I did 10 tests and it cropped up twice. Once you move out of the immediate vicinity of the base, there was like a, you can see it here, a big pause where just everything locks up and then everything works again. But the funny thing is, of course, that, well, first of all, this doesn't happen on the Pro that I have, at least. And secondly, you'd kind of think that rendering hundreds of zombies would be a bit more of a problem. But, the base PS4 is, in this location at least, it's actually holding up pretty well here. I mean, there's a couple of instances with Alpha and Overdraw that will cause a bit of a stutter on the base unit with all of those zombies in play. But overall, well, as I said, I did 10 runs in this area trying to sort of attract as many freakers as possible, and the good news is the performance holds up really well. It's just these weird kind of stutters when I left the immediate area, and I was thinking to myself, this is interesting because it doesn't sound like the issue you had, but then again, this is a Nero research station. I am leaving the area, and we are getting that similar big frame time stutter there.
Yeah, that is interesting. But as you say, though, it's more interesting that the Horde holds up so well. They've done a really nice job sort of optimizing these huge zombie crowds, because I seem to recall, some of the earlier demos, that seemed to be like the stress point. When those huge crowds would show up, you could see the frame rate kind of struggle a little bit at points. But clearly they've done a good job with that, and what's impressive about it is that it's such an active crowd. I mean, we've seen plenty of games in the past throwing tons and tons of character models around on screen. I mean, you could go back to, like, of course, Dead Rising, which is an obvious example, but that's constrained within a bunch of smaller areas, and the zombies don't do a whole lot. Here, the whole pack can chase you through the world, and it sort of flows over the landscape almost like water, so it's really well animated, it's very active, you can shoot and interact with all the zombies, and it doesn't really seem to tax their performance all that much, so I gotta hand it to them on that. They've done a good job. And actually, thinking of the older demos, I do think it's worth mentioning the issue that Bend Studio managed to overcome here with Unreal, and that's bad frame pacing, right? This is a problem with a lot of Unreal Engine 4 games that have shipped with 30 frames per second caps, where you end up with inconsistent frame pacing with the 30 cap, and in fact, older footage of Days Gone exhibited this very same issue as we tested in one of the old E3 demos. So, I mean, it may seem like a minor thing, but it was not a foregone conclusion that this would be completely solved, but it is.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, there are two elements to this. The first one is that the bad frame pacing is gone. We have a 30 FPS the way it should be, 33.3 millisecond persistence per frame for the vast majority of the duration. But the second thing is, when we revisit that old footage, performance wasn't great generally, particularly when lots of zombies are on screen. It really was quite unimpressive, actually. And, for them to have reached the point now where the whole game runs pretty much flawlessly, especially on Pro, it's pretty good, I thought.
Yeah, and that's something I mentioned in our HDR video, actually, and, I think it's worth mentioning again, is this is one of those games, it's been in development for a long time, it's been shown previously. It's exactly the kind of scenario you could imagine a developer showing something that wasn't quite ready, trying to give users an idea of what to expect, and then the final game comes out and it doesn't look as good. This has happened a lot. With Days Gone, it's been the exact opposite. The game has continued to improve with each showing visually, and the final product looks better than any of the previous demos, and it runs better.
We actually saw that incorrect frame pacing on the 2016 demo and the 2017 demo, so it was actually there for quite a while.
Exactly.
But final product, it's all fixed, and it's a really smooth, consistent look. In terms of those performance dips that we were talking about earlier, and kind of why they do make themselves felt, I think that it's because, first of all, the vast majority of the game plays absolutely fine, which means that when you do encounter slowdown, it sticks out more. You just aren't acclimatized to it. And secondly, similar to The Last of Us, this isn't a game that has lightning fast input latency response. It's quite a heavy feeling game, so when you lose performance on top of that, I think that it again, you just feel it in the controls, because it feels even heavier at that point. But I think, overall, what we should be stressing here is that by and large, where it matters, the performance is exactly where it should be. It's just mostly the streaming issue on the base that's a problem from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. For an open world game like this, especially running on Unreal Engine 4, I think they've done a great job of hitting the frame rate target, and if that's not something to worry about, basically, is what what we're saying. It's the performance is solid for this sort of game, so it looks great and it runs great. But I think, we also, we wanted to mention a little bit some of the differences that we spotted between the base system and the Pro visually as well. And I think I touched on some of this in the other video, but looking more closely again, for me at least, the thing that sticks out the most is the depth of field difference in some of the cutscenes, where it's much stronger on the Pro versus on the base, where sometimes it almost seems as if it's disabled or just drastically reduced, which is interesting because that effect is often tied directly to rendering resolution. So rendering at a lower resolution often results in a shallower depth of field, but it's exactly the opposite here. So clearly it's something that they thought about, and sort of adjusted specifically for each machine.
I wonder whether it is resolution related actually. I mean, if you look at a scene like this with one of the main characters here, on the face of it, it looks like the base unit is resolving more detail, but it's just that the depth of field effect isn't as strong on the base machine. It's stronger on the Pro, so there's a slight blur added to it. So kind of curious about whether that is by design, whether it's just a factor of the resolution. But yeah, you're right, it's a curious one, and it is the most obvious difference when you do a head-to-head comparison. I guess the next one, which is you probably won't notice it outside of head-to-heads, and I'm not sure if it's related to the shadow system or the ambient occlusion, but basically it's significantly heavier on the enhanced console on the PS4 Pro. It doesn't look bad at all on the base unit, but you can see that there's just much more shading under, like foliage in particular really stood out to me.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think that's one of the strong points of the visuals in the game, is the way that they shade and shadow the foliage and all the ground detail. It's extremely impressive and very sharp, and it is stronger on the Pro for sure, so I think it holds up better overall. It does feel slightly dialed back on the base, but again, it still looks roughly the same if you're just playing one or the other. It's really only something I noticed, at least when doing the head-to-heads.
Yeah, I think this is all nitpicky stuff, to be honest, apart from possibly the depth of field.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so when you look at it like this, and you look at the overall performance and the visual quality and the difference between the two machines, I mean, I think they've really done a tremendous job of utilizing their own technology with Unreal Engine 4, sort of utilizing it in a way that I don't think we've seen too much of. I mean, there are open world games like this with Unreal Engine 4, but not quite this detailed and vast. I mean, certainly not something like PUBG, but there's Fortnite. I mean, there's Sea of Thieves, and Sea of Thieves is gorgeous, of course, as well, but they all have a very different aesthetic, and this goes for like that high density level of detail, and just it's very gritty and nice looking, I'd say, in that sense. So it's really nice to see that they're able to deliver such a smooth game with this level of visual quality using Unreal. And in that sense, I think it's one of the benchmark titles for Unreal Engine for this generation.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of density, there's not really anything quite like it Unreal Engine 4 wise. I mean, it really is packed. It really is quite an impressive achievement in that regard.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So yeah, that's kind of how things are shaking out on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro versions of Days Gone.
The only thing that I feel like they missed out on was they should have had like if you recall in Uncharted 4, you could play Crash Bandicoot in there. They really needed to have a segment where Deacon plays Bubsy 3D.
Wow. I mean, that might be all that's left in the post-apocalyptic world.
Exactly.
Bubsy 3D. Okay, so let's wrap this one up then. Hopefully that answers all of your questions about performance on Days Gone. I kind of feel that, not being able to replicate some of these massive streaming issues that people had, maybe there's a bit more to this story, but I guess we'll find out in the fullness of time. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for joining me on this one, John.
Of course, thanks for being here.
And yes, of course, please do like and subscribe to support the work we do here at Digital Foundry. Ring the bell, as always, for instant notifications if you are indeed subscribed. So that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.